Watch till the end.
Hey yo, let's talk about classic albums. So a lot of times when we talk about something being a classic album, we tend to ask the question, what exactly defines a classic album? The way I see it, there are many variables that go into considering something a classic album. It's not just the quality of the work, but it's the context of the work itself, the era that it came in, the significance or the importance that it held during the time, and also how long you can go without listening to the album. And then when you finally do after a few years, it still holds up. So essentially, context, longevity, and quality. But you also have to take into consideration what that album also meant for that artist at the time as well. And that's why when we hear about the usual suspects, the Illmatics, the Blueprints, the Get Rich or Die Trying, the Doggy Styles, the Chronics, Ready to Die, 36 Chambers, etc., those variables are the reasons why those albums are considered classics. And you tend to run into those folks who only consider albums that came out 25 to 30 years ago classics, but nothing that came in within the last 10 to 15, with the exception of Kendrick Lamar, of course. But you tend to hear takes like Drake and J. Cole don't have classic albums, and to me, that's absurd. Based on the criteria that I laid out in this video, Drake and J. Cole do have classic albums. Because there's two things you have to think about. One, what doesn't make 2014 Forest Hills Drive and Take Care classics? And two, if these two albums are the ones that people constantly bring up in any kind of debate about whether or not Drake and J. Cole have classic albums, then surely they have to mean something, right? You can apply that same logic for anybody who says Illmatic isn't a classic or The Chronic isn't a classic. If these two albums are constantly talked about in a conversation about classic albums, then they must mean something, right? But the biggest thing that I kind of want to tackle in defense of Drake is when Homeboy says that Drake has a string of hits but no classic album. How does that make sense? You don't become the biggest artist on the face of this planet with a string of hits and not have a classic album. Name one artist in the history of music that has a string of hits like Drake and doesn't have a classic album. And I already know people are going to think to themselves, oh, Vanilla Ice had a big hit and he doesn't have a classic album. And while, yeah, that's a good point, I will ask you the question, you're comparing Vanilla Ice to Drake? Does that make sense? Because that's comparing Jeremy Lin to LeBron James. One good season versus 20 years of dominance.